If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars, could be a 50 or 100%, because we don't want their cars.
Critical. I love the idea or the aspiration of a Canadian car.
In early 2025, President Donald Trump made a statement that would reverberate across the North American automotive industry. Every car sold in America should be built in America. This wasn't just a bold political assertion, it was a rallying cry that would drive his administration's approach to trade. Trump didn't stop at rhetoric, he immediately put his words into action, beginning with steel tariffs, followed by a 25% levy on aluminum, and eventually slapping a hefty 25% tariff on finished vehicles imported from Canada. It was a sharp turn away from decades of cross-border collaboration between the US and its neighbor. The stakes were high. For years, the US and Canada had built an intricate network of supply chains that were deeply interwoven. The modern North American car isn't the product of one nation, but rather the culmination of thousands of individual parts manufactured across the US-Canada border. A piston, for example, might start its journey as aluminum in Quebec, be molded in Ontario, and eventually land in Detroit for assembly before returning to Windsor for engine installation. This complex cross-border choreography wasn't the result of inefficiency, it was a reflection of the unique specializations each country had honed over decades. Canada focused on producing castings, stampings, and high-volume parts, while the US managed final assembly, electronics, and software. This deep integration was the backbone of a competitive automotive industry, allowing giants like Ford, GM, and Stellantis to reduce costs, streamline production, and scale efficiently. But with the imposition of new tariffs, the stability of this system was suddenly in jeopardy. In a matter of weeks, what had once been a seamless partnership became a precarious gamble, with automakers facing the uncertain consequences of the new trade landscape. Trump's tariffs on Canadian steel and cars were designed to send a powerful message. The US was done with the status quo, and if Canada didn't play by Washington's rules, it would face the economic consequences. However, what many didn't anticipate was the significant damage this would cause to US automakers themselves. While the tariffs were intended to protect American jobs, they also created severe disruptions in the production pipeline, resulting in mounting losses. Ford and Stellantis, for example, reported losses of up to $5 billion due to the trade restrictions. The Canadian auto parts industry, which supplies nearly half of its output to American factories, found its order books rapidly shrinking. Meanwhile, US manufacturers saw ripple effects in labor relations, with unions expressing concern over the uncertainty that came with the new trade policies. But the impacts weren't just felt in the boardrooms of automotive companies. They began to spread beyond the factory walls, affecting workers, consumers, and entire sectors of the economy. As Canada braced for retaliatory measures, including potential tariffs on US auto exports, the crisis deepened. The automotive industry, which had long been the cornerstone of the US-Canada economic relationship, was now at risk of unraveling. Trump's gamble had left both countries at a crossroads with no clear path forward. The tension reached a boiling point when President Trump declared that the US would no longer negotiate with Canada unless certain conditions were met. The threat of 100% tariffs on Canadian vehicles loomed large, leaving Canadian manufacturers in limbo and driving investment away from the country. While Canada didn't immediately retaliate, the situation became increasingly fraught as the US pushed for drastic trade terms. In essence, Trump had issued an ultimatum, one that would fundamentally reshape the balance of power between the two nations. For all the talk of bringing jobs back to America, the reality on the ground painted a different picture. Instead of reinvesting in US production, automakers began scaling down operations, moving to cheaper manufacturing bases in Mexico, or cutting back altogether. As the economic fallout deepened, the very industries that Trump sought to protect were now struggling to adapt to a new, volatile environment. This is where the Trump administration's trade policy hits a critical juncture. It's not just about imposing tariffs, it's about reshaping the entire foundation of North American trade. While Trump may have scored some early political victories, the long-term consequences for the US auto industry and the broader economy were just beginning to unfold. The question now was whether the damage done to one of the world's most integrated manufacturing ecosystems could be undone, or whether the effects of this trade war would be felt for generations to come. The economic shockwaves of Trump's tariffs didn't just reverberate within the US, they crossed the border, landing squarely on Canada's doorstep. Canada, long seen as a reliable partner in North American trade, found itself suddenly in the crosshairs of a trade war it had never expected. For decades, Canadian industries, particularly in the automotive sector, had benefited from a deeply integrated supply chain with the US, but the new tariffs shifted that balance, forcing Canadian manufacturers to rethink their strategies and consider painful alternatives. As the tariffs kicked in, the Canadian steel industry, which relied heavily on exports to the US, became one of the first casualties. With 91% of Canadian steel exports going to the United States, the impact was immediate and devastating. A 50% tariff on Canadian steel, implemented in mid-2025, caused nearly 1,000 job losses in Canada's steel sector. The Canadian Steel Producers Association quickly raised alarms, warning that the tariffs could trigger a wave of closures in steel plants, many of which might never reopen. Cities like Sault Ste. Marie, once industrial hubs, began bracing for a potential post-industrial collapse. Meanwhile, Canada's automotive sector began to buckle under the weight of the tariffs. U.S. companies like Ford and Stellantis, already suffering from the increased cost of manufacturing, began pulling back. Ford and Stellantis even paused production lines in Ontario, citing rising costs and declining demand. Stellantis's Windsor plant switched to staggered shifts, while General Motors ramped up production in Fort Wayne, Indiana, diverting resources away from Canada. The shift was a direct result of Trump's tariffs, which raised the cost of Canadian-made vehicles by 25%, making them less attractive to U.S. buyers. Canadian vehicle exports to the U.S. dropped by nearly 23% in April 2025 alone, according to reports. This was a precarious position for Canada, which had long relied on the U.S. as its largest trading partner. The automotive industry had been a major contributor to Canada's economy, with over 1.8 million vehicles being exported to the U.S. annually. But now, the future of that trade was uncertain. Dealerships in Ontario and Quebec began reporting up to a 30% drop in sales of U.S. brands. Some customers were waiting for the tariffs to subside, while others were shifting their loyalties toward Korean and European models. In short, Canada's dependency on the U.S. was beginning to crumble, and the country had to scramble for a way out. The Canadian government's response to Trump's tariffs was measured. While Prime Minister Mark Carney did not immediately retaliate with tariffs of their own, a deadline was set for July 21, 2025. If a trade deal wasn't reached by that date, Canada would begin imposing counter-tariffs on U.S. exports, potentially targeting U.S. automotive exports in retaliation. Canada's steel sector, already in a dire situation, was pushing back against what it saw as an unfair penalty. In the meantime, Canada was trying to insulate itself from further damage. Federal procurement contracts were now requiring domestic steel, and new quotas were placed on cheap imports from non-free trade agreement countries. However, these measures alone were insufficient to restore stability to the Canadian economy. Behind closed doors, Canadian officials were still attempting to salvage what they could from the trade talks with Washington. Yet, they knew the stakes were high, not just for trade relations, but for the livelihoods of workers across the country. The pressure was mounting on Carney's government to deliver results. But even as Canada played its hand cautiously, it was clear that the country was already experiencing significant fallout from Trump's policies. Trump's rhetoric had a profound psychological impact as well. His repeated claims that Canada should become the 51st state were not simply meant as political theater, they were a declaration of dominance. While no one in Canada took these remarks seriously, they symbolized Trump's broader strategy. The United States would no longer tolerate a situation where its neighbor was reaping the benefits of preferential trade access without paying its fair share. In many ways, it was a power play designed to force Canada into submission. Trump's tariffs and threats of further penalties were intended to make Canada bend to U.S. economic demands or risk further isolation in the global market. As Canada faced the threat of increased tariffs, the future of the entire North American auto industry hung in the balance. Automakers were faced with increasingly difficult decisions. Should they scale back production in Canada, move to Mexico, or make the necessary adjustments to keep operations in the U.S.? For the time being, production forecasts were being slashed, and uncertainty clouded the decisions of major companies. The trust that had been built over decades of cooperation was now under intense strain, and it wasn't just about steel or cars, it was about the very fabric of North American trade itself. The fallout from Trump's tariffs extends far beyond the factory floors of US and Canadian manufacturers. It's reaching directly into the wallets of everyday consumers. The impact on both American and Canadian families has been profound, as the ripple effects of the trade war have resulted in rising costs for cars and appliances. According to a June report by the Center for Automotive Research, U.S. families are now spending an estimated $1,300 more per year on these items, a direct result of the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. For many, these increased costs are a heavy burden, particularly in an economy where inflation and rising prices are already stretching household budgets thin. In Canada, the effects have been similarly stark. With US-made vehicles now 25% more expensive due to the tariffs, Canadian buyers have begun to walk away from American brands in droves. Sales of US vehicles in Ontario and Quebec dropped by as much as 30%, a dramatic shift that has forced some dealerships to pivot toward European and Asian models. For others, the response has been less active. Customers are simply waiting, hoping that the tariffs will eventually subside. But as the months drag on, it becomes increasingly clear that this isn't just a temporary inconvenience. It's a long-term shift in the trade relationship between the two countries. At the same time, the U.S. auto industry is facing similar challenges. Buyers in both countries are delaying vehicle purchases, uncertain about the future of their investments. In the U.S., some experts warn that the short-term sales boosts seen at Ford and Hyundai in May are merely the result of pent-up demand being pulled forward, not new growth. The deep uncertainty brought about by Trump's tariffs is leading to a chilling effect on the automotive market, where consumers are unsure whether their vehicles will be serviced, warrantied, or supported in the years to come. In such an unpredictable environment, many potential buyers are choosing to sit out the market entirely. Despite the immediate economic chaos, Trump's administration continued to press forward with its strategy, insisting that the long-term goal was to rebirth American manufacturing. The notion was simple. If more manufacturing jobs returned to the U.S., it would eventually lead to a boom in domestic production and an overall economic revival. However, this vision overlooked a critical reality. The interconnected nature of North American manufacturing meant that tariffs, far from bringing about a renaissance in U.S. jobs, were instead destabilizing the very industries they were intended to protect. The chaos caused by these policies was exacerbated by Trump's leadership style, one characterized by unpredictability and a willingness to disrupt international relations for political gain. His frequent threats, including the possibility of halting trade talks with Canada and imposing punitive tariffs, created an environment of uncertainty that no company or consumer could navigate with confidence. While Trump may have hoped to force Canada into a more favorable trade deal through these tactics, the true cost of this strategy was borne not just by the governments, but by the workers, consumers, and families who were caught in the middle. At its core, the issue was about more than just trade. It was a test of power. Who would control the terms of the relationship between the US and Canada, and at what cost? By pushing Canada to the brink, Trump risked not only jeopardizing a long-standing trade partnership, but also destabilizing the entire North American automotive ecosystem. The consequences were already evident in the sharp decline of US-Canada vehicle trade and the growing uncertainties surrounding future production schedules. In addition to the economic fallout, the trade war was also undermining the trust that had been built over decades of collaboration. The integration of US and Canadian industries had been built on a foundation of policy certainty. The 1965 Auto Pact, NAFTA, and now the USMCA had all ensured that both countries benefited from the cooperative model. But with Trump's tariffs, that model was in jeopardy. And the question remained, could the system be repaired? Or would the damage done by unpredictable policies be irreversible? Trump's rhetoric around Canada becoming the 51st state added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. While many dismissed the comment as nothing more than political theater, it reflected a larger strategy of exerting dominance over Canada. The suggestion that Canada might become a part of the US wasn't just an idle threat, it was a signal that the Trump administration wanted more than just a trade deal. It wanted to reassert control over its closest neighbor. As the situation unfolded, it became clear that the impact of Trump's trade policies would extend far beyond the short-term losses in the automotive sector. It was about the future of North American cooperation and the long-term stability of the industries that spanned both sides of the border. Trump's approach, which sought to impose tariffs and force concessions from Canada, was a high-risk gamble, one that may ultimately leave both countries worse off. While some may view the tariffs as a victory for American manufacturing, the reality on the ground suggests a different outcome. The chaos and uncertainty created by these policies have not only hurt U.S. consumers, but have also put at risk the livelihoods of workers on both sides of the border. As the trade war rages on, the question remains, will North America find a way back to the cooperation that once defined its economy, or will the damage done by unpredictable trade policies have lasting consequences for generations to come? Trump's tactics may have won political points in the short term, but the long-term consequences of his trade war with Canada are still unfolding. The true cost of his strategy is yet to be fully realized, and it may take years before we understand just how deep the damage runs.